Morning, Yancy and everyone. I'm going to be quick. I'm going to respond from the Science Council and statutory bodies perspective or sector. My thoughts might appear a little bit all over the place, but it's because of the task at hand. So I'm just going to be very quick because we don't have a lot of time. This on presentation mode. Okay, in terms of, as I've indicated, I'm representing the Science Council and statutory bodies. And here I'm just showing you the statutory bodies that are registered with NSTF. Just as a disclaimer, I'm very much new into the NSTF. I've just attended my first meeting last month. So we have quite a lot of science councils that are registered with us, and those statutory bodies that I've just mentioned on the right of the screen. Let me be quick and go to the responses. I'm first going to look at the vision and the objectives. I think that the framework as a balance is very much balanced in terms of having looked at the benefits and some of the drawbacks that the just transition presents. The objectives are very clear, and the pathways to low carbon climate resilience economy, it's well detailed. And the value chains that are likely to be highly impacted have been fully addressed. Although an across the board sectoral analysis would have been useful, but based on the presentation that was given today, there's more information that has been shown there. But I think for the purposes of buy-in, we may want to be broader at the beginning so that everybody can see where we are coming from. Furthermore, the framework presents some high-level policy directions towards clean energy and sustainable food systems. And this is useful in terms of providing guidance for policy advocacy measures, especially for statutory bodies. The next part is the importance of monitoring and evaluation. I think this has been touched on the framework, and this is very, very critical given our track record in terms of implementation. What is key is that the framework should emphasize the importance of strengthening research and development institutions in terms of the infrastructure and expertise capacity. We have seen how important this is when we had to deal with the COVID-19. If it weren't for the fact that we had very good institutions, I think our response wouldn't have turned out the way it did. Also important is that the successful implementation of the just transition it's premised mainly on getting new money into the system, especially for the coal value chain. And it is important that when we think about this, it's easier when you're looking at it from the business end. But there are other parts of the value chain, especially the technology development value chain, that we need to be thinking about when we talk about funding. So there's quite a wide landscape that we need to factor in as we think about funding. And sustainable funding is very, very important. Both the public and the private funding, it's important. There are parts of the value chain that are highly risky and need to be de-risked. So we need to have this view as we approach funding. The other thing is that for public funded R&D, we need to acknowledge the fact that there are no new funds that may be available, especially in the short and medium term, given the fact that we have our economy, it's in a tight corner, and therefore most of what might happen in terms of funding will have to deal with reprioritization of existing funding. The national R&D thematic areas for the just transition, this should be developed so that this can guide the funding decisions for statutory bodies such as the National Research Foundation, Technology Innovation Agency, and the Water Research Commission. In terms of governance, the framework is very clear on the different levels of government, starting from national all the way to the multi-stakeholder governance. However, it is very, very important at the implementation level that we need to think about communities and the role of traditional authorities. This is not very explicit in the framework. This should receive a high priority given the fact that traditional authorities are custodians of land. And therefore, from an ecosystem service perspective, this is the critical level of governance that we need to look at. I just picked up this paragraph from the framework, where it says the framework does not deal with climate mitigation and adaptation policies per se, but rather with managing the social consequences and economic upside of those policies. These kinds of statements need to be looked at properly. I know what the Commission is trying to communicate, but it's important that we need to be broad. And when you look at the framework, at the later parts of the framework, this is covered very well. And this may be construed to mean that we are not emphasizing opportunities, but we are adopting a victim mentality. I think we need to strike a balance. And some of the language that I'm using, I'm just taking the liberty that the director has invited us to be very robust in our contributions. And therefore, the final just transition plan should consider policy options given the long-term nature of different mitigations. And there's a need for proper scenario planning to make sure that the mitigation and adaptation strategies that we come up with are well informed. In terms of the priority value chains, I think the framework is very spot on the value chains that will be highly affected, but we need to take cognizance of the fact that these value chains are at different levels of development. For example, the coal and the auto value chains, they are commercially well developed and have the ability to attract funding, but we need to remember that just transition will require high level of disruption in this particular area. So zero emission in the value chain is a viable option, but it will result in creation of new jobs. But this should be carefully balanced with the massive job losses. I think the language of jobs that we use in the country, in this country, we're sometimes very optimistic. And I think we need to take lessons from the National Development Plan around some of the targets that we talked about there. So I saw that there was reference to some international benchmark. We also need to look at this. The other priority sector is agriculture. And the way it appears in the framework, it has been picked up as a standalone. It might be worthwhile to look at agriculture, food and water sectors to emphasize the natural linkages that are there and the role that it plays in climate change. Agriculture is a wide landscape that includes commercial and smallholder farmers, and therefore we need to be differentiated in terms of how we approach them. The public goods will be very, very important for the resilience of the sector, and therefore investment in public R&D will be important. And mitigation and adaptation interventions for the commercial sector, that can be driven from the market side, but we need to remember that livelihood and survival, it's more important in the small sector level. And therefore, incentive schemes might work much better in terms of how we manage our natural resources. And there's adoption of new climate smart technology should be balanced with how they will impact jobs. And therefore, we should give preference to labor-intensive technologies. And I think it might be worthwhile to take agriculture, food and water sector and elevate them to become the face of the just transition. In terms of the table 3, that is around action plan to give immediate effect to a just transition, this table has slightly moved away from a strict sectorial approach, and I think it is important that we maintain a sectoral approach. especially when we look at implementation. And this will assist us with the buy-in. Just as I wind up, there are other risks that I think should be considered, such as lack of buy-in in the just transition. And this could be mitigated by extensive marketing of the just transition plan or strategy. Lack of coordination among different role players, which is often the case in terms of implementation in this country. We might want to have a coordinated body function that should be established. Lack of consistency in implementation. I think the first few years, there might be a lot of excitement and this might die down as we go. So we might want to formalize this by looking at the mandates of the different science councils and see how we elevate climate, the just transition in the mandates. And I think that is my input, and I will end it here.